The moment the live feed blinked on, Taehyung was already smiling. His signature, boxy and calm, the kind of smile that looked effortless but always carried an invisible metronome underneath, timed from years of cameras and crowded expectations. The podcast studio wasn't the massive broadcast stage he usually occupied. It was smaller, intimate by design, the kind of room where voices mattered more than visuals. Warm directional lamps hovered above a long oak table, cables sprawled like black vines across the floor, and acoustic panels hugged the walls to keep every breath crisp, every syllable close. The setup felt human. It felt safe. And that was exactly why it was dangerous. Across from him sat the host, a well-known media personality with the kind of relaxed charisma that made idols drop their shoulders a little too quickly. Behind the glass of the control booth, producers monitored levels and signals, but no one could monitor the heart rate of a conversation. Taehyung had come in expecting the usual year-end topics, album teases, travel stories, holiday chaos, what it felt like to finish another cycle in an industry that moved faster than memory. Fans tuning in expected the same: comfort content, casual laughter, a long night of voice-only presence to keep them company for the final days of the year. Taehyung crossed his legs and leaned toward the mic just enough for the movement to feel natural, not rehearsed. He greeted listeners like he always did when he wasn't on stage, not like a superstar, but like someone calling from the room next door. "It's been a long year," he said gently, voice smooth with a tiny rasp from late-night recording sessions. "But I'm happy to spend the last stretch talking to you like this." The internet loved him most in moments like these, when his poetic ambiguity felt like art, not distance. When his voice sounded like a slow walk through winter, quiet, reflective, textured, warm even when it talked about cold things. The host chuckled. "You look calm for someone who survived 2025's chaos." "Calm is muscle memory," Taehyung answered with a small smile in his tone, "not proof of peace." The host didn't know it yet, but that sentence would become the thesis of the night. Because peace is what people assume idols have when they see composure. Peace is what they sell to themselves when the alternative is realizing the people they admire are carrying storms they weren't trained to weather. The conversation rolled gently at first. The host asked about music. Taehyung answered in metaphors that felt like soft poetry. He talked about recording in studios that smelled like hot metal and polished wood, where melodies were built from 3 a.m. emotions and cold Americano cups sweating beside lyric sheets. He talked about the members, but always carefully, always in ways that protected the invisible borders between affection and interpretation. Because idols don't get privacy, they only get territories that fans haven't colonized yet. Then came the lane Taehyung didn't expect. Not a harsh question, not a scandal, just a name, just a future. "Let me ask you something ARMY keeps debating," the host said, leaning back with a grin. "Hypothetically, if Jungkook shows up one day and says he's met his future wife, what do you think your reaction would be?" The room temperature didn't change, but the air pressure did. It was like someone had quietly detuned a guitar string in a perfectly tuned room. No sound, only wrongness. Taehyung blinked once, slow, controlled, but the blink felt heavier than the smile that had preceded it. His brain registered the word hypothetically like a warning siren wrapped in velvet. Hypothetical futures for idols were never hypothetical. They were drafts, and the world would publish drafts even if you never approved them. He inhaled, not shaky, not dramatic, just a breath that suddenly sounded audible in a room engineered to hide breaths. "A wife," Taehyung repeated softly, like testing a word he had never rehearsed emotionally. The host raised a brow. "Yeah, just hypothetical, don't worry, no headlines." Taehyung almost smiled at that. "Headlines don't need invitations anymore." The host laughed, thinking it was poetic deflection. It was. Taehyung leaned back in his chair, eyes dropping briefly to the pop filter like it was a mirror instead of a microphone accessory. Jungkook, future wife. A question millions had asked themselves on his behalf, but had never asked him directly. Taehyung felt something tighten in his chest, not jealousy, not romance, not fandom theatrics, but the abrupt grief of realizing the world thought Jungkook S future was a public intellectual property. A future that had been discussed so much online. Taehyung himself had subconsciously accepted that he was no longer a participant in the same timeline. He exhaled again. My reaction wouldn't be shock, he said quietly. It would be realization. The host frowned. Realization of what? Taehyung paused, gaze lifting slowly now, eyes steady but distant like someone reading subtitles that hadn't been written yet. That even the futures we joke about stop belonging to us when the world rehearses them louder than we do. No one in the room knew a single tear was forming at the edge of his eye. Not falling yet, just forming. Like a draft the world hadn't leaked, yet. But the world would. Because the most gripping stories aren't the ones shouted. They're the ones idols never intended to narrate live, but the mic was already open, the world already listening, and Taehyung was about to learn that intimacy feels most perilous when it has an audience. And millions of listeners, unaware of the emotional fault line beneath the question, were leaning closer, thinking they were watching a casual year-end conversation. They weren't. They were watching the moment before the first crack, when a man known for emotional equilibrium would discover that even the gentlest question can excavate something buried too deep to survive daylight. The host thought the conversation would regain its rhythm after the tension dipped, but rhythm doesn't return just because silence sits politely for a few seconds. Taehyung could feel the shift like a sub-bass hum, inaudible to untrained ears, but unmistakable to someone who has spent his life performing emotional precision. The podcast had always marketed itself as a space where idols could talk without armor, where the mic felt like an invitation rather than a spotlight. But Taehyung knew better. There is no such thing as an unobserved moment when you are loved at scale. The observation just becomes quieter, hungrier, disguised as concern. The host leaned forward, palms open, surrendering the entertainer posture he had held minutes earlier. He said carefully, we can steer away if you want. Taehyung shook his head once, small but certain, like sealing a decision that had been forming long before the question was asked. I don't want to steer away, he replied. I want to steer back, to myself. The host blinked, unsure how a hypothetical question had detonated a philosophical war inside a man who had built a career on emotional balance. That was the irony. The balance was real, but the peace was not. Balance is often just the art of hiding the tremor, not removing it. Taehyung let his eyes drift to the control booth glass again. The producers were whispering now, frantic hand signals floating like subtitles behind a soundproof aquarium. They wanted a cut, a containment, a rescue from the moment that was already slipping beyond editorial control. But Taehyung wasn't listening to them. He was listening to the echo in his own head. The echo sounded like Jungkook. Not his scandals, not his dating debates, not the endless digital speculation about his adulthood milestones, but the real Jungkook, warm, earnest, accidentally honest, a man whose emotions used to live in the same shared universe as his. He remembered an unfiltered conversation during a rehearsal break years ago, when their popularity was a rocket with no brakes and no map. Jungkook had dropped beside him on the studio floor, sweaty hair clinging to his forehead, voice breathless with youth and possibility. Jungkook had said then, do you ever get scared that the world will define us faster than we can define ourselves? Taehyung had looked at him, amused but intrigued. Define us as what? As characters, Jungkook had answered. Not people, Taehyung had smirked. We are characters to them. Yeah, Jungkook had nodded, eyes serious, but I want to make sure we stay the main characters in our own story. That sentence had felt like a cool line at the time, a poetic flourish, but Taehyung could hear the gravity of it now, years later, when the world had indeed defined their futures so loudly that even their hypotheticals sounded rehearsed by strangers. Fans didn't just imagine their idols' futures. They storyboarded them, cast partners into them, debated weddings Taehyung himself had never been mentally present for, not because he wanted romance, but because he had always assumed the members' futures were something they would narrate together when the time came. The pain wasn't about a wife. It was about the realization that Jungkook's imagined life had become a public debate stage where Taehyung no longer had a seat, not because he was excluded, but because the world had filled the seats for them. The world doesn't wait for answers. It only waits for reactions. Taehyung's voice dropped low but not quiet, just stripped of performance intonation. I think people misunderstood why I repeated the word wife, he said. It wasn't shock, it was mourning. The host frowned deeper. Mourning? Yeah, Taehyung nodded. Mourning the fact that the world thinks our futures are theirs to draft first. The host exhaled slowly. But you don't want to be in that draft, Taehyung smiled, tiny, weary, but honest. I want to be in the real one. The one we write ourselves, when no one else is holding the pen. The host sat back, stunned by the emotional architecture of that answer. Fans weren't watching a romantic confession. They were watching a man articulate the existential cost of losing authorship over imagined futures. The kind of cost that makes you realize affection is safest when it's private, but most perilous when it's public, because the public doesn't see nuance. It only sees ownership. And ownership is always binary to an audience that refuses ambiguity when it comes to love. Taehyung wrapped both hands around the mic stand lightly, a gesture grounding enough to keep him steady, symbolic enough for millions to overanalyze later. I spent years answering questions with metaphors to protect things I didn't want the world to misinterpret, he said softly. But maybe the thing I protected most was the illusion that we still had time to decide who narrates our endings. The host finally understood. This wasn't heartbreak from romance. This was heartbreak from premature conclusion. The world had jumped to conclusions about weddings, partners, endings, futures, genres, outcomes. And Taehyung had just realized he was grieving a future that hadn't even happened yet, only imagined too loudly by people who weren't cast in the original script. And the most devastating part, the grief was real, but the cause was a story that belonged to everyone except the people it was about. The episode might have ended, but the conversation didn't. Conversations like that never truly end, they metastasize. They spread into comment threads, fan theories, headline debates, reaction videos, and long, winding social media autopsies, dissecting every micro-expression like it was evidence in a trial no one had agreed to stand in. But Taehyung wasn't in a trial. He was in an awakening, the kind that doesn't feel victorious when it happens, only unbearably honest. He stayed seated in the booth long after the lights dimmed to standby warmth, long after the crew footsteps faded into the padded hallways outside, long after the host's apology circulated online like a half-healed bandage applied too late. Taehyung had never blamed the host. The host was only the messenger, and the message wasn't even the real wound. The wound was the collective illusion that idols have hypothetical futures instead of real ones, futures that are somehow separate from consequence, futures that can be discussed casually without emotional property rights. He leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes heavy with a thought that felt older than his career, older than BTS, older than fandom architecture itself. He remembered the early days when the members still talked about the future like it was a locked diary they would open together someday when the world was less hungry. Back then, the world wasn't less hungry. They were. They had hoped that hunger could be negotiated. Jungkook had always carried curiosity like a quiet spark. The spark had never been loud, but it had always been electric enough to make Taehyung pay attention. He remembered Jungkook's voice clearly now, from a night when they sat on a studio couch sharing exhaustion like brothers share inside jokes. "Taehyung," Jungkook had said, "do you ever think we'll stop being quotes and start being people again?" Taehyung had laughed then, dramatic by instinct. "Kook, we are quotes. That's our job." Jungkook had tilted his head. "Then I hope we get quoted accurately." The laughter that followed had been lighter than air. The air now felt heavier than stone. Because the accuracy hadn't been the point anymore. The point was whether the world would ever let them own the punctuation between the quotes. Taehyung finally stood, walking out of the booth into the lounge again. The same staff member waited by the couch scrolling sentiment trends that Taehyung still refused to look at. The staffer glanced up. They're calling it heartbreak, he said softly. Taehyung smirked once, almost instinctively. They always call it heartbreak when they can't categorize it. The staffer frowned. Then what is it? Taehyung exhaled, leaning back against the couch armrest. It's future theft, he said. Not heartbreak. Future theft. The staffer's eyes widened slightly. You mean like the world stole the ending before it happened? Taehyung nodded slowly. Exactly. And when endings get stolen early, even love sounds like a spoiler. The staffer went quiet. He finally put the phone down, realizing Taehyung wasn't speaking for sympathy but for reclamation. Sympathy asks for comfort. Reclamation asks for narrative sovereignty. Taehyung sat back down again, posture relaxed now, but not because the moment was healed. Because he had crossed the threshold where pain transforms into clarity. Pain makes you reactive. Clarity makes you immovable. If Jungkook finds love someday, Taehyung said softly, I hope it gets announced by him, not imagined into existence by people who think imagination is harmless. The staffer nodded. And the tears? Taehyung smiled faintly again, eyes distant. Not romance, he said. Just grief from seeing someone else write futures for people I care about before we even got to open the document ourselves. The staffer didn't push. There was no need. Millions were pushing enough for the entire world. Outside the lounge, winter still pressed against the windows. The city lights shimmered like a million unasked questions, but Taehyung wasn't afraid of questions. He was afraid of conclusions. Questions leave space. Conclusions close doors. The world had been closing doors for idols for years, packaging futures like collectibles fans could trade opinions on, futures that were somehow more discussed than lived. The irony was suffocating, but irony was never the story. The story was that a simple question about love had exposed a larger truth. Idols don't lose themselves when they cry. They lose themselves when the world believes they never could. Taehyung didn't cry because of Jungkook. He cried because the world had made Jungkook's imagined future louder than their real present. And when imagined futures outvolume reality, reality starts sounding like betrayal, even when no betrayal ever happened. That night would trend not because it was romantic, but because it was human, unfiltered by performance, stripped of media bilingualism. The world thought it had seen a crack. What it had really seen was the moment Taehyung realized that the future only hurts when you're no longer allowed to be its narrator first. And for the first time in years, Taehyung didn't want to be mysterious. He wanted to be accurate, because accuracy isn't poetic, it's self-preservation. The next morning arrived without asking permission, just like the question had. Taehyung always thought mornings were softer than nights, but some truths don't soften under sunlight, they only sharpen. His phone had been vibrating since dawn, notifications stacking like unsolicited editors waiting to rewrite his tone, his intention, his silence, even his breathing. But he didn't open any of it. Taehyung never opened the world when he was still trying to open himself. He sat in the lounge again, but this time the room wasn't humming with shock. It was humming with inevitability. The podcast had triggered something global, but what hurt him most wasn't the spread. It was the misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is heavier than criticism because criticism at least acknowledges the truth exists. Misunderstanding insists the truth must be something else. A stylist entered first, holding foundation that could cover redness but not revelation. They'll want you camera ready today, she said gently. Taehyung nodded, but the nod felt different now, compliance without surrender. Make me look calm, he said. Not okay, calm. She hesitated for a beat. Isn't okay the goal? Taehyung's lips curved into a faint, ironic smile. Okay is a conclusion, calm is a continuation. The stylist didn't argue. Continuation is a language every crew member understands. After makeup, his manager entered with a tablet but no talking points. That was the first sign the industry was scared, not because he cried, but because he defined the reason himself before they could. Managers hate undefined variables. They fear them more than scandals because variables have longer legs. They keep audiences seated, scrolling, watching, analyzing long after the segment ends. The manager said, voice quiet but unsteady, the public wants a narrative. They always want a narrative, Taehyung replied. But this time I want the narrator. The manager exhaled, rubbing his forehead. You already narrated, that's why it exploded. No, Taehyung corrected softly. It exploded because I narrated. The manager sat down across from him slowly. He had seen Taehyung go viral for surreal interviews, 4 a.m. poetic musings, stage theatrics, deep-voiced jazz metaphors, runway visuals, artful mystique, calculated emotional restraint. But he had never seen him viral for emotional ownership. Ownership is different from vulnerability. Vulnerability is what happens when you break. Ownership is what happens when you refuse to disappear afterward. The manager tapped the screen lightly but didn't turn it toward him. Fans think the tears were romantic. Romance is the easiest misdiagnosis, Taehyung said. It doesn't require context, only projection. The manager frowned. Then what should we call it? Taehyung leaned back again, posture open, voice level like the tide before a monsoon. Call it overdue, he said. Not romantic, overdue. The manager blinked. Overdue. Yeah, Taehyung nodded. Overdue grief, overdue honesty, overdue self-definition, overdue realization that futures shouldn't be discussed like fan property before the people living them even get to speak. The manager sighed again. You know the company will want a statement eventually. I'll give a statement, Taehyung said, gaze steady now, but not a surrender. The staffer from the night before entered then, holding another coffee. This time he sat beside him instead of across from him. You didn't look at anything, he asked. I don't want to see drafts, Taehyung answered. I want to live sentences. The staffer nodded slowly, understanding more than Taehyung expected him to. Well, the staffer said, the sentence you lived last night, it moved them, more than they expected, more than the industry ever prepared them for. Taehyung smiled again, but this time the smile wasn't jagged. It was weary, wry, and quietly proud. Good, he said, because movement is proof I still exist outside the quote marks. The lounge went quiet again, but this time the quiet felt reclaimed, not imposed. Taehyung didn't want to erase the moment. He didn't want to romanticize it either. He wanted to historicize it, not as a love confession, not as a media accident, but as the night the world saw an idol become a person live without rehearsal. Not because he wanted the world to see it, but because the world had finally forced him to admit the person was there all along. The real shock wasn't the tear. The real shock was that the world was shocked at all. Because idols don't cry when they're weak. They cry when the world is late to realizing they were human enough to. By the time evening returned, Taehyung could feel the narrative pressure thickening again. Not loud like a breaking wave, but persistent like winter wind worrying at a door that refuses to stay shut. He was no longer surprised by how quickly the world assumed it knew him. He was surprised by how confidently the world assumed it could finish a story it never lived the beginning of. He found himself back in the practice room later that night. Not for a schedule, not for choreography, just for muscle memory that didn't feel borrowed from cameras. The room smelled the same as it always had, rubber flooring warmed by stage lights, faint metallic sweetness from mic stands stacked in the corner, conditioner mist lingering from hairspray battles past, and the quiet echo of thousands of hours spent becoming someone the world thought it already understood. The difference now was that Taehyung finally understood the room back. Jungkook entered later, hoodie slung low over his eyes, hair still slightly damp from a rushed shower. He didn't knock. He never needed to. I figured you'd be here, Jungkook said, voice casual but eyes searching, like someone scanning a horizon for smoke even when the fire was already named. Taehyung was seated on the floor, knees drawn up, guitar leaning beside him like an unplayed sentence. I figured you'd know, he answered. Jungkook sat down across from him, but not with interrogation posture, just with presence. Presence was always their unspoken contract. Taehyung, Jungkook began carefully. I watched the clip. Taehyung looked at him, gaze steady but softened at the edges. And I realized something, Jungkook said. People don't get shocked by emotion. They get shocked by the truth behind emotion. Taehyung's lips twitched into a small, genuine smirk. You've gotten annoyingly wise. Jungkook shrugged. It happens when you get quoted inaccurately for long enough. Taehyung laughed once, short, warm, familiar. The kind of laugh fans recognize from lives when nothing felt scripted because nothing was scripted. Then you understand why it hurt, Taehyung said. Jungkook nodded. I do, but I want to hear it from you anyway, not the internet's translation. Taehyung paused, eyes drifting briefly to the ceiling lamps that were always too bright for confessions. But confessions were never the genre here. This was just truth between two men sitting on practice room rubber. It hurt, Taehyung said softly, because the question sounded small but implied a conclusion I never rehearsed emotionally. Jungkook frowned lightly. A conclusion like what? Like the world thinking your future belongs to their imagination first, Taehyung answered. Not yours. Jungkook went quiet for a moment, letting the sentence land without trying to remix it into comfort. And the wife part? He asked finally. Taehyung looked at the guitar strings beside him, then back at Jungkook. Not jealousy, he said. Not romance. Just grief that the world decided a milestone for you before you ever announced you were walking toward one. Jungkook exhaled, leaning back on his palms. So the tears weren't about me finding love someday, he said. They were about the world assuming love is the only thing that matters in the future. No, Taehyung corrected gently. The tears were about the world assuming love is the only thing we're allowed to talk about safely. Jungkook tilted his head. And what do you want to talk about safely? The fact that we're still becoming, Taehyung said. That endings aren't decided. That love doesn't need to be categorized to be real. And that caring about someone's future doesn't automatically mean you want to marry into it. Jungkook smiled faintly then, a small dimpled curve, familiar enough to soothe practice rooms but not large enough to trend online. Then I'll tell you my truth too, Jungkook said. I don't care who imagines my future. I care who's still standing in it when the world gets bored. Taehyung raised a brow. And who's that? You, Jungkook said simply. The members, the people who were there before the conclusions. Taehyung leaned back too, letting the shared quiet settle between them like snow that had finally found the ground instead of melting midair. Then that's the genre, Taehyung said quietly. Not romance, not tragedy, not revolution, just continuation. Jungkook nodded, bumping his shoulder lightly against Taehyung's. Continuation is underrated, but it lasts longer than shock. Taehyung picked up the guitar then, fingers brushing the strings lightly. Not playing yet, just acknowledging sound exists again. Let them trend the tear, he said softly. I'll trend the truth in the real timeline. Jungkook laughed once, mirroring the tone. You really think you can outright the world? Not outright, Taehyung answered. Pre-write. There's a difference. Jungkook stood slowly, brushing rubber flecks from his joggers. Well, he said with a grin, next time someone digs up a hypothetical, I hope you dig back with a guitar instead of a tear. Taehyung smiled, standing too now, eyes warmer than the night before. Next time, he said, I'll make them gasp for the sentence, not the crack. The room exhaled around them quietly again, padded walls absorbing nothing because nothing needed absorbing anymore. Taehyung didn't regret the moment. He didn't regret the honesty either. He only regretted that the world needed shock value to listen to something that should have been obvious all along. Because the truth wasn't that a Jungkook question made Taehyung cry. The truth was that a human question finally made Taehyung speak. The backlash didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like an algorithm with a conscience malfunction, relentless, loud, binary, incapable of nuance, but dangerously convinced it was protecting something holy. Overnight, headlines multiplied like wildfire sparked by a single ember. Every entertainment outlet wanted to translate the same moment into a different verdict. Was Taehyung spiraling? Was Jungkook cornered by a question he never asked to answer? Was the industry about to bury another idol beneath expectation instead of empathy? Taehyung didn't touch social media for hours after the episode aired. He let the silence exist first, because he knew if he tried to speak while the world was shouting, the truth would drown beneath interpretation. But eventually, even silence felt like participation in a script he never auditioned for. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, water running behind him, lights humming above, the reflection staring back like someone who had spent too many years being watched but not enough years being seen. The tears he had shed were still faintly mapped beneath his eyes, but they no longer felt like weakness. They felt like evidence that the human layer was intact, even if the world kept poking at the idol's surface. Jungkook texted first. No greeting, no preamble, no damage control. Just a single line, "You okay?" It was simple, almost blunt, but Taehyung could hear the subtext beneath it. The question wasn't asking for a performance update. It was checking for fractures. Taehyung finally typed back, "I will be. Give me 10 minutes." Jungkook replied with a thumbs up, the digital equivalent of someone nodding quietly from across a room where the air still needs settling. When Taehyung stepped out, Jungkook was already in the living room, sneakers unlaced, elbows on his knees, scrolling without reading, the posture of someone bracing but refusing to spiral. "I didn't think a question about someone else's future could feel like a funeral," Taehyung said, leaning against the doorway. Jungkook looked up. "It's not the future part that hurts," he answered. "It's the ownership part." Taehyung nodded slowly. Jungkook always had a way of slicing directly into the core, without swinging emotionally. Taehyung walked over and sat beside him, not too close, not too far. Proximity was a dialect they had spoken for years without misreading. "They're saying the reaction wasn't you," Jungkook said quietly. "They're wrong," Taehyung answered. "The reaction was me. The interpretation was." Jungkook huffed a laugh, tired but warm. "You're allowed to cry, Taehyung," he said. "You're just not allowed to be reduced to a headline." Taehyung's gaze drifted toward the darkened TV screen, the same TV that had broadcast dissected stills of other idols unraveling years before. "They always zoom on the tear," Taehyung murmured, "because the tear is the only part they think they can afford to empathize with." Jungkook shook his head. "Empathy shouldn't need a budget." Taehyung finally opened social media that night. Not to scroll, but to post. The message was short, direct, unpolished by PR language, intentionally so. He wrote it like someone sending smoke signals instead of polished declarations. "I cried because I care about a future that isn't mine to define. I cried because the world assumes love and destiny are spectator sports. I cried because idols aren't supposed to feel out loud, but humans are. If that shocked you, maybe it's time the industry stops teaching shock instead of sincerity." Jungkook read it from over his shoulder, nodded once and said nothing. Nothing was needed. Silence can also be a signature when the truth is already ink. Within seconds, fans rallied again. Not with fury this time, but with something softer, fiercer, more dangerous to institutions built on obedience. They replied with paragraphs of support, threads about mental health, essays about idols being boxed into archetypes, shared screenshots of Taehyung laughing freely in old live streams, reminding the world that this man wasn't fragile. He was exhausted by reduction, not emotion. He was grieving ownership, not love. And grief isn't a scandal. It's a signpost. Meanwhile, entertainment hosts everywhere suddenly wanted to apologize retroactively. Not because they regretted the question, but because they regretted being caught asking it without permission from nuance. One American late-night legend even referenced the moment vaguely on air. "Maybe it's time we stop asking idols to predict futures we wouldn't dare demand of ourselves." HYBE executives panicked privately because panic is the only language institutions speak fluently when humans start trending humanity instead of obedience. Taehyung and Jungkook sat in quiet after the post went live, watching the city lights flicker outside the apartment windows like witnesses who didn't want interviews. "Do you think this changes anything?" Jungkook asked finally. "Not the world," Taehyung answered. "Just the terms of engagement." Jungkook smiled then, small, genuine, a continuation dimple instead of a trend-worthy grin. "That's enough," he said. "It's more than enough," Taehyung replied. "It's the first time the sentence belonged to me instead of the echo." By the time the next morning arrived, the conversation around Taehyung and Jungkook had evolved again. Not calmer, but sharper, more curious, less accusatory in tone. The world had spent a full night treating the moment like a referendum, and now it wanted to treat it like a mystery. The question was no longer why did he cry, but what was the truth behind the silence before the tear. Taehyung woke up before sunrise, which was unusual. Usually Jungkook was the one packing the apartment at that hour, sleeves rolled, mind racing through workout circuits or unfinished song stems. But today it was Taehyung who was moving first, footsteps soft but intentional, like someone who had rehearsed quiet for years and finally wanted to weaponize gentleness instead of volume. He made coffee in the small kitchen near the window. The aroma filled the apartment, familiar and grounding, dark roast, slightly sweet, comforting enough to reset a heartbeat that had been trending panic the night before. Jungkook emerged minutes later, rubbing his eyes, hair wild, posture slouched in the way only someone exhausted by public narratives can afford. He didn't say anything at first. He just accepted the cup Taehyung passed him, the steam fogging between them like punctuation that didn't need words to justify its existence. "They're not done talking," Jungkook said quietly after a sip. "They never are," Taehyung replied, leaning on the counter, eyes focused on the horizon outside. "They just change genre." Jungkook exhaled through his nose, half laugh, half resignation. "So what's today's genre?" "Investigation," Taehyung said simply, "but without evidence." Jungkook frowned. "They have evidence, clips, screenshots, leaks, narrative claims." "No," Taehyung corrected. "They have artifacts. Evidence requires context. Context requires consent. Consent requires honesty." They skipped all three. Jungkook went quiet, letting the logic settle instead of rushing to solve it emotionally. That was the difference between them. Jungkook reacted like a spark. Taehyung processed like snow, slow, heavy, blanketing, inevitable. Taehyung scrolled through fan messages finally, not reading headlines, just people. The comments weren't asking him to be smaller anymore. They were asking him to be more real. One message read, "You don't owe us your heart, but thank you for letting us see it breathe." Another said, "If the industry can't handle honesty, we'll build a louder stage for it." That one hit differently, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Fans had always been stronger than contracts. Contracts were just louder than feelings, until feelings found a microphone. Meanwhile, reporters were already outside the HYBE building again, not condemning, just circling, sniffing for narrative fault lines. They were asking members in airport ambushes if BTS was stable, if the company was punishing them, if Taehyung and Jungkook were being managed separately for optics. Members didn't answer. And for the first time, Taehyung didn't blame them. Silence was a strategy, just not the kind executives understood. Later that morning, Namjoon called a private meeting in the dorm. Not the boardroom, not the studio, just the place where sweat, laughter, arguments, love, and legacy had always mixed without permission from PR teams. The hallway was dim when Taehyung arrived, socks quiet on the floorboards, coffee cup still in hand. The members were already there. Namjoon seated like someone bracing to speak for the group, even when speaking for himself was already a risk. Yoongi leaning back like a verdict that refuses to clap. Hoseok with worry lines deeper than choreography hours. Jin standing like a bridge waiting for weight. And Jimin and Jungkook both sitting like punctuation marks that had been rewritten too many times. Namjoon looked up first. "Hyung," he said, eyes fixed on Taehyung, "tell us in your words, not the internet's subtitles." Taehyung sat down slowly, guitarless this time because instruments weren't the genre today. Truth was. "I cried," he said quietly, "because the question assumed Jungkook's life was already a decided plot. I cried because the world wants idols to narrate futures they're not even allowed to live publicly yet. I cried because the moment didn't belong to the podcast. It belonged to years of expectation that were never mine to distribute emotionally." The room went silent again, but not suffocating like last night. This silence felt like agreement that didn't need analytics to justify its existence. Jungkook nodded once. Jimin exhaled shakily. Yoongi rubbed his temples. Hoseok looked at the window. Jin finally spoke. "The next time the industry asks for ownership of our milestones, we give them 7 truths instead of 1 tier." Namjoon looked at Jin. "7 truths don't trend as fast," he said. No, Yoongi interjected dryly, but they last longer than shock. Taehyung didn't smile at that. He didn't need to. The smile would come when the narrative belonged to them again, not when the internet forgave it, but when the industry finally realized forgiveness was never the currency. Attention was, and attention had finally learned empathy, not obedience. And somewhere beneath the hum of studio lights that refused sleep, Taehyung realized the world hadn't been shocked by a tear. It had been shocked by a human refusing to let someone else own the sentence.